What if the person you loved most became the world's greatest threat? In a quiet Kansas town, a child crash lands from the stars, bringing hope and mystery to a struggling couple desperate to become parents. But as he grows, so does the darkness within him, a sinister power awakening in the shadows of his seemingly ordinary life. Kyle and Tori Breyer soon discover that their son, Brandon, is no savior. He's something far more terrifying. As strange occurrences escalate and blood is spilled, their family is torn apart by a truth they cannot escape. Brandon isn't human. With a force from the stars guiding his transformation, the Breyers must confront the unthinkable. Can they stop Brandon before he fulfills a prophecy that will reduce the world to ashes? Or will they perish under the weight of the Crimson Dawn? Prepare yourself for a heart-pounding journey of betrayal, terror, and apocalyptic horror. This is Brightburn, a dark reimagining, a story where love turns to fear and humanity's fate hangs by a thread. Are you brave enough to face what lies ahead? Chapter 1: The Falling Star. The Kansas sky, once a soft blue fading to amber in the dying light of evening, exploded in a violent blaze of color. A streak of fire tore across the horizon, and for a moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. It was as if the universe had exhaled, a great and terrible sigh that resonated with something ancient and primal. The object, a fireball, a comet, something far stranger, plummeted toward Earth at a terrifying speed. The sound was deafening as it thundered through the air, cutting across the serenity of the night like a beast on the hunt. Tori Breyer had been standing at the kitchen window, idly drying the last of the dishes, when the flash of light made her pause. She blinked, thinking it was a shooting star, but the force of its descent was too much, too sudden, too violent. She dropped the dish towel and ran outside, her heart hammering in her chest. The land around her farm was flat, endless, and quiet, but now it felt alive in a way she couldn't explain. Her eyes scanned the darkening sky, and she saw it, the trail of flame arcing downward, disappearing beyond the horizon. "Kyle!" she shouted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. "Kyle, get out here!" Kyle Breyer emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans, his brow furrowed with confusion. He was a man used to the rhythms of farm life, slow, deliberate, grounded, and the sudden chaos of something so unnatural made him uneasy. His eyes followed Tori's gaze, narrowing as he saw the streak of fire growing dimmer as it sank behind the distant tree-line. "That's not no meteor," Kyle muttered, his voice gruff with uncertainty. "I know," Tori whispered, her throat tight. She felt something deep and unsettling, stir in her gut. It was as if the earth itself had trembled. "What do you think it is?" Kyle asked, stepping toward her, his eyes still locked on the darkening sky. "I don't know, but we need to check it out." Without another word, they grabbed the truck keys and hurried to the old pickup, the engine roaring to life as they sped down the dirt road that led into the flat expanse of fields and scattered woods. The truck's headlights cut through the growing darkness, illuminating patches of land that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was nothing here except the occasional clump of trees, the silhouette of a barn, the rusted remains of a tractor. The quiet was all-consuming, broken only by the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. They drove for what felt like an eternity, their eyes straining into the night, hoping for a sign of the crash. It wasn't until they saw the smoke, thin at first, then rising in thick black plumes, that they knew they were close. Tori's stomach churned as they neared the wreckage. The fire burned low now, but the air still smelled of something acrid and metallic, something almost wrong. Kyle's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "This is it," he muttered. The truck jolted as it hit a particularly deep pothole, throwing Tori against the seatbelt. She barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind was elsewhere, fixated on what lay ahead. They reached the clearing, where the wreckage of the object lay scattered. The fire had mostly died down, leaving only embers and smoke curling lazily into the sky. Tori could feel her heartbeat in her throat as she stepped out of the truck, the crunch of dry earth beneath her boots loud in the eerie silence. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting between the wreckage and the darkening trees around them. Something about the place felt wrong, like the ground itself had been tainted. Kyle joined her, his boots making the same sound, but his steps were heavier, more cautious. There, among the twisted metal and charred fragments, was a strange object that didn't belong. It was small, smaller than Tori had expected, but the sight of it sent a chill down her spine. The thing had the shape of a capsule, a dark, metallic hue that gleamed faintly under the dim moonlight. There was no sign of a pilot, no sign of anyone else. Torai approached the wreckage cautiously, her hand shaking as she reached for the dark, gleaming surface of the object. It was cold to the touch, colder than the night air. She turned to Kyle, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you think this is?" Kyle didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched beside the wreckage, his eyes scanning the surroundings. There was something unsettling about the absence of life here, the silence in the midst of something so unnatural. No animals had approached. No birds had flapped overhead. It was as though everything had been driven away. Then a sound, soft, barely audible at first, came from the wreckage. It was a faint cry, the sort of sound one might expect from an animal in distress. But this wasn't a howl or a squeal. It was the unmistakable sound of a child. Torai froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked back at Kyle, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" Kyle stood up quickly, moving toward the wreckage. His hand hovered over the metal, his fingers trembling. The cry came again, a thin wail of desperation. Without thinking, Tori pushed past him, her heart pounding in her chest. She moved closer to the wreck, her breath fogging in the cold air. The closer she got, the more she could hear. There was something alive inside. She knelt down beside the wreckage, her fingers trembling as she lifted a large piece of debris. Beneath it, in the dark, something shifted, a small form, wrapped in a metallic cocoon. It looked so fragile, so small, as though it had been waiting for them. A baby. The child was pale, his skin bruised from the crash, but he was alive. His red eyes opened slowly, staring up at Tori with an unnerving intensity. His mouth parted, and he let out another faint cry, his tiny hands reaching out toward her. Tori's heart swelled. She had always dreamed of a child, longed for the sound of a baby's cries in the house. And now, here he was. She reached for the child, her hands gentle as she cradled him against her chest, feeling the warmth of his body seeping through her coat. What do we do now?" Kyle asked, his voice strained with disbelief. Torai looked at the child in her arms, his glowing red eyes now fixed on her. There was something strange about his gaze, something unsettling. But she pushed the feeling aside. "We take him home," she said softly. "We raise him. He's ours now." But even as she spoke, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them back from that wreckage, something that wasn't just the child in her arms. The air felt colder, the world outside seemed darker, and she couldn't escape the sensation that the world had shifted, just slightly forever. Chapter 2. Something in the barn. The farm was quiet again, at least for the moment. Torai and Kyle Breyer stood side by side on the front porch of their modest farmhouse, their eyes scanning the distant horizon. The night air was sharp, carrying the scent of earth and dampness as the world seemed to breathe around them. The stars, brilliant and cold above them, filled the sky with an unnatural clarity. It was as if they were witnesses to some celestial event, one that had begun when the strange boy had arrived. Torai couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the way the child's red eyes had glowed in the darkness as they pulled him from the wreckage. He'd been so small, fragile, just a baby. But as she rocked him in her arms that first night, she'd felt something stir inside her, something that chilled her to her core. It was as though his presence had triggered something ancient in the universe, something that had been waiting patiently for this moment. "Are you sure about this?" Kyle asked, his voice low. He sounded more concerned now than ever, the weight of their decision pressing down on him. Torai nodded, her eyes distant. "He's ours now. What else can we do? We can't just leave him." Kyle exhaled sharply. He'd agreed to take the child in, but over the past few days, he'd started to question that decision. The boy, Brandon, had shown signs of something off. From the moment they brought him inside, things had been different. Torai, perhaps too wrapped up in the maternal instinct of raising him, didn't seem to notice the strange behavior at all. But Kyle did. There were things he couldn't explain, things he was afraid to confront. For one, Brandon never cried. Not like a normal baby. His cries were wrong. They were guttural, primal. Almost like something was forcing him to make that sound. It didn't feel human. And the way he looked at them with those glowing red eyes, always intense, always knowing, made Kyle shiver when he wasn't looking. It wasn't just that. Brandon was already walking. At 5 months. And more disturbing still, he didn't need to be taught. He simply knew. He could balance on his own, crawl faster than a normal baby should, and sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he would stare at things, a wall, a shadow, and tilt his head, as though he were listening to something just out of earshot. When Tori wasn't around, Kyle caught himself asking questions. What if Brandon wasn't really a child? What if something else was inside him? What if they had brought something into their home that wasn't meant to be there? The silence between them stretched, each of them too afraid to speak what was on their minds. Finally, Tori spoke, her voice soft but firm. We'll figure it out. He's just adjusting. But deep down, both of them knew that wasn't true. Brandon wasn't adjusting. He was changing. And no one knew how fast it would go, or where it would lead. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows and the farm came alive with the sounds of birds, cows, and the wind rustling through the fields, Brandon sat in his high chair, staring intently at the wooden table in front of him. He was nearly 6 months old now, though his appearance suggested a child of at least 2. His body was small but solid, his muscles rippling beneath his smooth skin in a way that felt unnatural. Tori placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of him, and he reached for it with his tiny hands, his fingers curling around the spoon. But instead of playing with it like a typical baby, Brandon brought the spoon to his mouth and started eating in slow, deliberate motions. His eyes never left her face as he ate, watching her with that unsettling intensity that made her skin crawl. She tried to ignore it. I think he's hungry, she said to Kyle, forcing a smile, trying to dismiss the growing dread in her heart. He's growing so fast. Kyle, standing at the counter, grunted noncommittally, his gaze still uneasy as he looked at the boy. The sound of Brandon's steady eating, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl, was the only noise filling the kitchen. But then, without warning, Brandon's hands shot up, knocking the bowl to the floor. The sound of ceramic shattering broke the stillness, and Kyle flinched as the shards of the bowl scattered across the wooden floor. Tori's heart skipped a beat as she leaned over to pick it up. Brandon, she began softly, but her voice faltered when she saw the look in his eyes. His pupils were dilated now, and for the first time, she saw something in them that made her stomach tighten. Anger. Pure, raw fury. It was unlike anything she'd ever seen in a child. The moment passed quickly. Brandon's expression shifted back to something unreadable, and he turned his attention back to the broken bowl as if nothing had happened. But Tori's breath was shallow now, her mind racing with the question she didn't dare ask aloud. Was this normal? Was any of this normal? That night, after Kyle had gone to bed, Tori sat in the living room with Brandon, who had settled into her lap, his tiny hands curled around the hem of her sweater. He seemed at peace now, almost content, but Tori couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt too still, too quiet. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to linger a little longer than they should, and every creak of the house made her jump. As she gazed at Brandon, she could feel him watching her. And then, without warning, he raised his head to look at something across the room, his face blank. Tori followed his gaze, but the room was empty. No one was there. Her breath caught in her throat as a cold shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't imagining it. The air had changed. It was thick, charged with something she couldn't explain. Something ancient. Something otherworldly. Brandon's eyes shifted back to hers, and for a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of recognition. Something far too mature for a child of his age. The flicker of something alien. She stood up abruptly, her heart pounding, and placed him in his crib, making sure the door was securely shut. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow. Something was wrong, and she didn't know how to fix it. The following days brought more unsettling occurrences. Tori woke up one morning to find the barn door wide open. She was sure she had closed it the night before, but now, there it was, ajar. The wind had blown, she thought, but as she stepped inside, she noticed something even more disturbing. The animals were restless. The cows were bellowing nervously, the horses were pawing at the ground, and the chickens were huddled together in the corner of the coop. Something had disturbed them. She found Brandon there, standing at the threshold of the barn, looking out over the fields. He hadn't made a sound, but he was watching something. His expression was unreadable, his body tense, as if listening to something distant. Brandon, she called gently, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed, unwavering. The chill that ran through her spine was impossible to ignore. She stepped forward, but before she could reach him, Brandon turned and walked toward the barn. It was the way he moved, too steady, too sure of himself, that made Tori's heart race. When she caught up to him, he was standing in the middle of the barn, staring into the shadows, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She followed his gaze, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the dark corners of the barn and the rustling of the hay. Tori's heart was pounding in her chest as she approached him, calling his name again. But he didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing as if focused on something just beyond her reach. That was when she heard it, the faintest whisper, a voice from somewhere deep in the barn. A voice she couldn't understand. It sent a chill through her bones, and for a moment, Tori couldn't breathe. She felt a presence, something ancient, something not entirely human. "Brandon," she whispered, her voice shaking now. "What's happening to you?" But the boy didn't answer. He only stared, his eyes glowing brighter in the darkness. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Unseen. The days grew longer, the air heavier. The summer heat that hung over the small farm was oppressive, as if the land itself was suffocating under the weight of something unspoken. The Breyers had never been accustomed to the strange stillness that had settled over the farm since the arrival of Brandon. The once familiar rhythm of daily chores, feeding the cows, collecting eggs, and tending to the crops, had become a hollow echo, a mechanical repetition that lacked the warmth it once had. It was as if the very soul of the farm had been drained. Cal had noticed the change first. It started with the animals. They had become restless, pacing back and forth in their pens, eyes wide with a kind of terror. The horses snorted and stomped their hooves in the middle of the night. The cows would bellow incessantly, and the chickens would refuse to leave their coop. There was no explanation for it, no reason they could find. Nothing had changed in the routine, nothing had shifted in the air, except for Brandon. And that, more than anything else, was what kept Kyle awake at night. Brandon had only been with them for a couple of weeks, but it already felt like a lifetime. His unnatural growth had escalated beyond anything Tori could understand. By the time he was 6 months old, he was already walking steadily, moving faster than any normal baby would. And then there were the other things, the way he would sit in a corner, staring at nothing, and the strange way his eyes glowed in the dark. The faint red light that pulsed in those unblinking eyes was the only thing that illuminated the room in the dead of night. It was hypnotic, mesmerizing, and deeply unsettling. One evening, as Tori prepared dinner in the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced up, expecting to see Brandon, but the boy wasn't in the room. The house was too quiet. The hum of the refrigerator, the crackle of the oven, and the ticking of the clock were the only sounds she could hear. But it was an oppressive silence, the kind that pressed on her chest, making it harder to breathe. "Brandon?" she called, her voice trembling slightly as she set the knife down on the cutting board. There was no response. Her stomach tightened. A wave of panic surged through her, and her hand gripped the edge of the counter. The sense of something wrong gnawed at her insides. She'd heard stories, paranoia in the middle of the night, people imagining things in the dark. But this wasn't that. This was real. The air felt different, colder, even though the summer heat hung heavy in the house. "Brandon?" she called again, her voice louder this time, as she made her way toward the living room. Her steps faltered when she reached the doorframe. Brandon was standing there, just beyond the threshold, his tiny hands pressed against the wall. His eyes were fixed, unblinking, on something in the dark corner of the room. He wasn't moving, his body completely still as though listening for something beyond the realm of human comprehension. The faint red glow of his eyes cast an eerie light across the room, bathing everything in an unnatural hue. Tori's heart skipped a beat. "Brandon." She said his name again, though she could feel her voice trembling now. But the boy didn't respond. He simply continued staring, his expression unreadable, his body rigid. It was as if he were listening to something that was just beyond their reach, something that wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. A chill ran down Tori's spine. She reached for him, her hand outstretched, but Brandon recoiled, taking a small step back, his gaze never leaving the shadow in the corner. "Brandon?" Her voice faltered, the fear finally breaking through. He blinked slowly, and in that moment, Tori thought she saw something shift in his expression. A brief flash of recognition, something almost human, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Instead, his eyes glowed a little brighter, and he turned toward her with an eerie calmness that made her blood run cold. Without a word, Brandon stepped forward, his small feet padding across the hardwood floor, and he reached out for her. His tiny fingers curled around her hand, but his grip was unreasonably strong. The pressure was firm, almost painful, as if he were trying to pull her toward the dark corner where he had been staring. "Brandon, let go," she said, her voice trembling. But Brandon didn't listen. His grip tightened, and the sense of terror in Tori's chest grew. She pulled harder, trying to break free from his hold, but it was useless. He was too strong. The boy was impossibly strong. "Let go," she cried again, her voice cracking as panic surged through her. This time, she was sure she saw something that she couldn't place, in his eyes. A darkness, a malevolent force that reached beyond the child in front of her. Something that shouldn't belong in a boy. Something that wasn't human. Brandon's grip loosened, and with a small, almost imperceptible motion, he turned and walked away, back to the living room corner. The sense of dread lifted only slightly, and Tori staggered back, clutching her chest. Her heart was pounding, her breath ragged. What was happening to him? What had they brought into their home? Her mind raced with the questions that had been growing since the day they had found him. What was this child? Where did he come from? Was he even human? And most terrifying of all, what was he capable of? The night grew darker as the hours passed, and the air in the house grew colder. Tori tried to push the feeling of dread away, but it lingered in the corners of her mind. She couldn't get the image of Brandon's eyes, glowing with that unnatural red light, out of her head. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown that gnawed at her. It was the feeling that something far more dangerous was hidden beneath the surface, something that had been inside him all along. Meanwhile, Kyle was in the barn, as he often was these days. He had taken to spending more time with the animals, his old friends, trying to find a semblance of normalcy in the routine of farm life. But tonight, even the animals were on edge. The horses stamped their hooves against the barn floor, snorting and throwing their heads in the air as though they were trying to escape something unseen. The cows, normally docile, were restless, mooing anxiously and pacing in their stalls. Kyle could feel it too, the change in the air. He was no longer sure what to believe, no longer sure of anything. Tori had been trying to tell him that things were normal, that Brandon was just a special case, but the more he saw, the more he felt something was wrong. He heard a soft whisper, almost like a voice, coming from the corner of the barn where the shadows were deepest. It wasn't an animal. It was something human. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat as he turned, but there was nothing there. The barn was empty, except for the animals, all of them watching him with wide, terrified eyes. A sudden noise behind him made him whirl around, but when he looked, all he saw was the silhouette of Brandon standing in the doorway. "Brandon," Kyle called, his voice tight with unease. The boy didn't respond. Instead, he simply stared at him with those eyes, those glowing red eyes, before he took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. Kyle felt a twinge of fear, but he forced it down. This was his son, his adopted son. There was nothing to fear. But deep inside, Kyle knew that whatever had come from the crash, the thing that had crawled into their lives, into their home, wasn't human. And it was growing stronger by the day. "Brandon, what's happening to you?" Kyle asked, his voice shaking now. The boy didn't answer. He simply stood there, watching him with a gaze that seemed to pierce into his very soul. And then, as if he had heard something that only he could hear, Brandon turned and walked deeper into the barn, disappearing into the shadows. Kyle stood there for a long moment, the weight of fear pressing down on him. Something was happening, something beyond their understanding. And with each passing day, it was becoming clearer. There would be no turning back. Chapter 4. The Shiver of Things to Come. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Tori woke with a start, her eyes snapping open as a sharp pain gripped her chest. She gasped for breath, her body drenched in cold sweat. It was the same feeling she had every time she woke from the strange, fragmented dreams that haunted her nights. Dreams of distant lights flickering, whispers she couldn't understand, and a deep, almost suffocating presence closing in on her. She sat up in bed, clutching the sheets around her, her heart pounding in her ears. The room was still dark, save for the faint glow of early morning light peeking through the curtains. A distant rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, though the sky had been clear when she had gone to bed the night before. The atmosphere felt charged, like the air before a storm. And that feeling, the feeling that something was wrong, was stronger than ever. She swung her legs out of bed and stood, her body trembling slightly from the lingering fear of the dream. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the remnants of sleep from her mind, but the unease remained. It had been growing steadily over the past few weeks. Brandon's behavior, his growing strength, his unnatural calm in the face of things that should have terrified him. It was all wrong. Tori shook her head. No, it wasn't just wrong. It was terrifying. She quickly dressed and headed downstairs, her feet heavy with dread. The house was quiet, too quiet. It had been like this for a while now, The silence was deafening. Even the animals, who had been acting strange for days, seemed to be unnaturally still, as if holding their breath. When Tori entered the kitchen, her eyes immediately went to the high chair where Brandon usually sat in the mornings. But there was no sign of him. She felt a momentary wave of panic. She had heard nothing, no sounds of him waking or calling out, but it was unlike Brandon to stay quiet for long. Her eyes scanned the room frantically, and that's when she saw it. The kitchen door to the barn stood wide open, the soft morning light streaming through it, casting long shadows across the floor. Her stomach twisted. Brandon had been outside again, without a word. It was becoming all too familiar. He had a habit of disappearing without any warning. At first, she'd chalked it up to him being unusually curious for his age. But now, she wasn't so sure. Every time he wandered off, there was a sense of dread that followed, like something was watching him, guiding him. Tori's breath caught in her throat as she made her way toward the door. She couldn't explain it, but something felt different today. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the weight of everything that had been building was about to come crashing down. "Brandon," she called softly as she stepped into the barn. The smell of hay and earth filled the air, but there was something else, something foul. A metallic tang that made her stomach churn. "Brandon," she repeated louder this time. There was no response, but she could hear faint rustling in the back of the barn. Her pulse quickened as she walked further inside, her eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no sign of him. It wasn't until she reached the farthest corner that she found him, standing perfectly still, staring at the wall with that eerie, unblinking gaze. "Brandon, what are you doing?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady as she approached him. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hands slowly, his tiny fingers curling into a fist. For a moment, it looked almost like he was pointing at something in the shadows, something she couldn't see. His eyes never left the spot, never wavered. It was as though he was communicating with something, or someone, just out of her reach. Tori felt a shiver race down her spine. "Brandon, come inside." "It's dangerous out here," she urged, but her words seemed to fall flat. The boy remained motionless, as if lost in a trance. The faint whispers began again, the same low, unintelligible murmurs she had heard the night before. The same whispers that had crept into her dreams, that had filled her mind with a cold dread she couldn't escape. She glanced around the barn, her senses heightened, but there was nothing visible. Just the long shadows of the wooden beams, the stacks of hay, and the eerie quiet. "Brandon," she whispered, stepping closer, but before she could reach him, there was a sound, a crack, loud and sudden, that echoed through the barn. Tori flinched, her heart leaping into her throat as she turned toward the sound. It had come from behind one of the hay bales, something moving, something unnatural. She took a cautious step forward, but before she could react, she felt a presence, something cold and overwhelming, brush past her. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Brandon still stood motionless, his eyes unblinking. A growl, deep and animalistic, rumbled from behind her. It was a low, guttural sound that sent a surge of terror through her body. She spun back toward the shadows, her eyes searching frantically, but all she could see were the hay bales. The sound of something moving in the darkness grew louder, closer. Tori's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the corner, trying to keep her eyes trained on Brandon, who hadn't moved a muscle. The growl grew louder, more menacing, until it seemed to reverberate in the walls of the barn itself. Then, just as quickly, it stopped. She was shaking now, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. It had felt real, too real. And yet, there was no sign of any animal. No physical threat. Just the deep, suffocating presence of something dark, something that had taken root in this place. Something that had taken root in Brandon. She needed to get out of the barn, away from whatever this was. But before she could turn and leave, Brandon's voice broke the silence. His words were barely audible, but they carried a weight that made her blood run cold. "They're watching," he whispered, his voice unnatural, alien. "They're waiting." Tori's knees buckled as the world seemed to tilt, the air around her pressing in on all sides. She tried to speak, to ask him what he meant, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe. The suffocating pressure that had been building for weeks was finally reaching its breaking point. Brandon's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, she saw something in them, a terrible clarity, a knowledge of something far beyond her understanding. Suddenly, she felt an overwhelming urge to run, to leave. She stumbled back toward the barn door, her eyes still locked on Brandon. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, pulling at her, the sensation too intense to ignore. As she reached the door, she turned to look at him one last time. Brandon's small figure stood in the middle of the barn, his eyes glowing a deep, almost violent red. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling her ears and her mind. "Brandon!" She cried, but the boy didn't move. The barn door slammed shut behind her as she fled into the fields, gasping for air, the sound of the growls echoing in her mind. Kyle had spent most of the day outside, trying to push the mounting anxiety that had taken hold of him. He didn't understand what was happening to his family. The animals, the strange occurrences around the house, and Brandon's unnatural behavior. It was all too much. He had spent hours in the barn trying to fix things, to make sense of the chaos, but it was futile. By the time the sun began to set, Kyle had found himself sitting on the edge of the porch, staring out into the distance. The sky had darkened into a bruised purple, the wind picking up as if in response to the storm that seemed to be building within him. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else, a gnawing feeling at the back of his mind that told him everything they had believed was wrong. Brandon had become something he couldn't control, something that wasn't human. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, no matter how much he wanted to protect his family, the truth was becoming clear. Brandon wasn't just growing. He was changing. And with each passing day, that change was becoming more dangerous. The door to the house creaked open behind him, and Kyle's heart leaped in his chest. It was Tori, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror he had never seen before. "Something's happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Kyle's stomach dropped as he stood, rushing to her side. "What happened? What's wrong with Brandon?" Tori shook her head, her eyes wild with fear. He said they're waiting. And I heard them. I heard them growling. There's something in the barn, Kyle. Something, not human." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had felt it too. The unease, the terror. He had heard it in the whispers, felt it in the air. But he hadn't wanted to believe it. "Where is he now?" Kyle asked, his voice hoarse with dread. Tori didn't answer immediately. She just stared into the distance, her eyes filled with a hopelessness that chilled him to the bone. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think it's too late." Chapter 5: The Awakening. The morning sun did little to ease the tension that hung in the air like a thick, choking fog. The days had begun to bleed together, each one marked by an increasing sense of unease and a rising feeling that they were running out of time. Tori hadn't slept in days, her mind too occupied with the strange events and the growing terror that seemed to follow them at every turn. It was as though the world itself had shifted, and nothing made sense anymore. The silence that had descended over the house felt oppressive, like a living thing that pressed in on all sides. Brandon was the focus of all their fears, though neither Kyle nor Tori dared speak it aloud. They couldn't. The truth was too much to bear. Brandon had never been normal, he had never been human. They had seen the signs, the strange occurrences, the way he had started to grow too quickly, his abilities escalating beyond anything a child should be capable of. The things he said, the things he did, nothing about him was natural. And now, as each day passed, the fear had begun to take on a new shape. It wasn't just Brandon anymore. It was the things that had been unleashed with him. And it wasn't just his powers. It was the growing darkness around him. The way the world seemed to bend and crack at the edges, as if something was slowly creeping through the cracks, something that had no place in their reality. Tori moved through the house in a daze, her mind heavy with thoughts that she couldn't shake. The barn had been silent the night before, and Brandon had stayed inside for once. But that didn't mean the terror had stopped. No, it had only shifted. The whispers had returned, louder than ever, but now they weren't just in her mind. They were real. They came from the walls, from the ground beneath her feet, from the very air itself. She felt the presence of something watching her, even when she was alone. It was like a constant, gnawing sensation, a cold pressure on her chest that never went away. And when she closed her eyes, she could still see Brandon, his eyes glowing red, staring at her with an expression that was far beyond his years, far beyond what any child should know. She had told herself it was a dream, that she had been imagining things, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. She had seen it with her own eyes. He was changing. He wasn't just growing. Something was happening to him, something terrifying and alien. And it wasn't just him. It was what he had brought with him. "Mom!" Tori jolted, her breath catching in her throat as she turned to see Brandon standing in the doorway, his small form silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. His red eyes glowed faintly, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. It was as if time had stopped, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Brandon tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Are you okay?" It was a simple question, but the way he asked it sent a chill through her bones. There was no warmth in his voice, no innocence. There was only a cold, detached quality to his words, as though he was asking about something far beyond her ability to comprehend. Tori swallowed hard, trying to push the fear down. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "Just tired." He nodded slowly, then took a step toward her, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. "I'm not scared anymore," he said quietly, his eyes darkening slightly, as if something were shifting behind them. Tori's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, though she was already dreading the answer. Brandon didn't respond immediately. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "The waiting is over," he said softly. The words hit her like a physical blow. The waiting was over. The sense of impending doom that had been hanging over them was finally coming to fruition. Tori's heart raced as she took a step back, her mind racing to make sense of his cryptic words. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but she knew she wouldn't get any. Not from him. Not now. "I need to go," he said suddenly, his voice low and purposeful. "There's something I have to do." Tori's chest tightened. "Brandon, where are you going?" "What do you mean?" But the boy was already walking toward the front door, his small form moving with a strange, unearthly purpose. He didn't look back. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched him leave. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. It was as though everything inside her had frozen, her body paralyzed by the terror that had gripped her heart. She had to stop him. She ran after him, her heart pounding in her chest. But by the time she reached the door, he was already outside, walking down the path toward the woods. She opened her mouth to call after him, but the words caught in her throat. It was too late. He was gone. Tori stood on the porch, the wind tugging at her hair, her heart heavy with a growing sense of dread. She knew what he was going to do. She didn't need him to say it. The thing that had been waiting, whatever it was awakening. And they were running out of time. Kyle had been working outside when he saw Tori rush past him, her face pale and tight with fear. He didn't ask questions. He simply followed her, his heart already pounding with dread. He had felt it too, the growing sense of something wrong, something so far beyond their understanding that it was almost impossible to face. When he reached the edge of the property, he saw Tori standing near the woods, her eyes wide with panic. "Where is he?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Tori didn't say anything, her eyes locked on the darkened tree line. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's gone into the woods." Kyle's stomach twisted. He felt it then, the deep, gnawing sense of fear that had been building ever since Brandon had arrived. It wasn't just the boy anymore. It was everything that had come with him, everything that had been unleashed in their lives. Something was coming. Something was waiting. He didn't waste any more time. He grabbed Tori's hand and pulled her toward the woods. "We have to find him," he said, though he had no idea what they would find. The woods were dense and dark, the trees so close together that only small slivers of light made it through. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, the ground soft beneath their feet. Kyle's breath came in quick, shallow bursts as they pushed deeper into the trees, the silence around them oppressive and suffocating. "Brandon," Tori called, her voice echoing in the stillness. There was no response. They continued to push forward, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of him. And then they saw it, something in the distance, a faint glow in the blackness. Kyle's heart leaped in his chest. It was Brandon, but he wasn't alone. At first, Kyle couldn't make out what he was seeing. There was a shape beside Brandon, a shadow that seemed to flicker and shift with the wind. And then he realized what it was. It wasn't a person. It wasn't anything human. The figure was tall, too tall, and its features were distorted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. Its eyes were the same glowing red as Brandon's, but there was something wrong, something terrifyingly wrong, with the way they looked at him. Tori screamed, and Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The figure turned toward them, its head tilting at an unnatural angle, as though it were studying them. It made no move to approach, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with a dark, malevolent energy. Brandon stepped forward, his small body standing between them and the figure. His eyes glowed even brighter now, and his expression was completely unreadable. "They've come," he said softly, his voice detached. "It's time." Tori froze. What is it, Brandon? What have you done? But the boy didn't answer. He simply stood there, his gaze fixed on the figure, as if waiting for something. And then, without warning, the air seemed to pulse with an energy unlike anything Kyle had ever felt. It was like a wave of raw, untamed power crashing over them, and suddenly, everything around them seemed to twist and warp. The world seemed to fracture, reality itself bending under the weight of the presence that had arrived. The figure moved, its form shifting and distorting as it approached Brandon. "It's too late," Brandon said, his voice barely audible, a strange sense of calm in his words. "They're awake." Chapter 6. Through the Veil. The world had fallen silent. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm night, but an unnatural stillness that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. Kyle and Tori stood rooted at the edge of the woods, unable to look away from the terrible figure looming beside their son. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. It wasn't anything that should exist. Brandon stood in its shadow, his small frame dwarfed by its towering, distorted form. The creature seemed to flicker in and out of focus, its edges bending and warping like a mirage. Its glowing red eyes bore into them, unblinking, unwavering, and filled with a malevolent intelligence. Kyle's hands clenched into fists as he fought the overwhelming urge to flee. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But he couldn't leave Brandon, not like this. Not when he needed them most. "What is this, Brandon?" Kyle's voice cracked as he stepped forward, his gaze darting between his son and the impossible figure. "What have you done?" Brandon tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't do anything, Dad," he said, his voice calm and cold. "They've always been here. They're just finally ready to show themselves." Tori's breath hitched, her hand clutching Kyle's arm as if her grip alone could anchor her to reality. "Who are they, Brandon?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What do they want?" Brandon's expression didn't change, but there was something in his gaze, something distant, alien, and completely devoid of the warmth she had once known. "They want me," he said simply. "And they want you to see." Before either of them could respond, the creature moved. It didn't walk or glide. It simply shifted, as though the space it occupied had folded around it. One moment it was beside Brandon, and the next it was directly in front of them. Tori screamed and stumbled back, pulling Kyle with her. The air around the creature crackled with energy, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle their very bones. The smell of ozone and decay filled their nostrils, making their stomachs churn. Kyle forced himself to stand his ground, his eyes locked on the creature's twisted form. "If you want him," he growled, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger, "you're going to have to go through me." The creature tilted its head, mimicking Brandon's earlier gesture. Its gaze shifted to Kyle, and for a moment, it felt as though the weight of the universe had pressed down on him. His knees buckled, his breath caught in his throat, and his vision swam with incomprehensible shapes and colors. Then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound but a feeling, a deep, reverberating presence that echoed in their minds. "We do not take. We awaken." Kyle staggered back, his head pounding from the force of the words. Tori clung to him, her sobs muffled by the roar in her ears. "What does that mean?" she cried, her voice barely audible over the oppressive hum. "What are you doing to him?" Brandon stepped forward, his small form eerily calm in the chaos. "They're showing me who I really am," he said, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that sent chills down their spines. "And they'll show you too." The creature raised one elongated arm, its fingers, if they could even be called that, stretching impossibly long. The space around it seemed to ripple as it reached toward them. Tori screamed again, pulling Kyle back with all her strength. "We have to go," she cried, her voice breaking. "Kyle, we have to go." But it was too late. The creature's touch didn't come in the form of physical contact. Instead, it was as if a door had been flung open in their minds. The world around them dissolved, replaced by a swirling vortex of light and shadow. They were no longer in the woods. They were nowhere. And yet they were everywhere. Images flooded their senses. Alien landscapes bathed in harsh, unnatural light. Towering structures that defied the laws of physics. Skies filled with swarms of dark, writhing shapes. They saw stars being born and dying in the blink of an eye, galaxies colliding in a cosmic dance of destruction and rebirth. And in the center of it all, they saw them. The entities weren't beings in the way they understood. They were vast, incomprehensible forces, each one radiating a presence so overwhelming that it felt like being crushed under the weight of 1,000 suns. They had no faces, no physical forms, only a sense of infinite power and ancient, unknowable purpose. Kyle and Tori fell to their knees, their minds reeling from the sheer magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just another world. This wasn't even another universe. This was something outside of everything they had ever known, something that existed beyond the boundaries of reality itself. You are not alone. The voice resonated through them again, deeper this time, filling every corner of their consciousness. You have been chosen. He is the bridge. Kyle struggled to speak, his voice barely a whisper. Chosen for what? The answer came not in words but in a flood of images. Destruction, chaos, entire civilizations consumed by darkness. The entities weren't saviors. They weren't benevolent. They were harbingers, the first wave of an unstoppable force that would sweep across existence like a plague. Brandon turned to his parents, his expression unreadable. It's not what you think, he said, his voice soft but firm. They're not here to destroy us. They're here to change us. Tori reached out for him, tears streaming down her face. Brandon, please, she begged. You don't have to do this. We can fight this. We can stop it. But Brandon shook his head. It's too late, Mom. This is what I was made for. This is what I am. The vortex around them began to shift, the lights and shadows swirling faster and faster. The pressure in the air grew unbearable, and Tori screamed as she felt her body being pulled in every direction at once. Brandon, Kyle shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Don't let them take you. Brandon turned to face them one last time, his glowing red eyes filled with a strange mix of sadness and determination. They're not taking me, he said. I'm taking them. And then, with a final pulse of energy, the vortex collapsed. Kyle and Tori were thrown back into the woods, the ground beneath them solid and cold. The air was still and quiet, the oppressive hum gone. They looked around frantically, their hearts pounding in their chests. Brandon was gone. Chapter 7: Echoes of the Abyss. The woods felt different now. The oppressive silence remained, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a strange stillness that wasn't natural. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to happen. Kyle and Tori lay sprawled on the cold ground, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The events in the vortex had left them drained, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and their minds reeling from the weight of what they had seen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The enormity of what had just happened made words feel insignificant. How could they explain what they'd witnessed? How could they even begin to process it? Kyle was the first to move. He pushed himself to his knees, his head pounding and his chest tight with unspoken terror. His gaze darted around the clearing, searching desperately for any sign of Brandon. But the boy was gone. Brandon, he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. Brandon, where are you? Tori sat up slowly, her face pale and streaked with tears. Her hands trembled as she clutched at the earth beneath her, as if anchoring herself to reality. He's gone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Kyle, he's gone. Kyle turned to her, his face contorted with a mix of anger and grief. No, he said, shaking his head vehemently. He's not gone. He's still out there. We just have to find him. Tori's eyes filled with fresh tears as she looked at him. You saw what I saw, she said, her voice cracking. You know what they said. He's not our Brandon anymore. The words hit Kyle like a physical blow. He staggered to his feet, his fists clenched and his jaw tight. I don't care what they said, he growled. He's our son, and I'm not giving up on him. But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his heart. The images from the vortex were burned into his mind. The vast, incomprehensible entities, the destruction they had wrought across countless worlds, and Brandon's glowing red eyes as he embraced his horrifying destiny. Still, he refused to let go of hope. He couldn't. We need to get out of here, Tori said, her voice trembling. She glanced around the woods, her eyes darting nervously between the shadows. They might come back. Kyle hesitated, his gaze lingering on the spot where Brandon had stood moments before. Finally, he nodded and reached down to help Tori to her feet. Let's go, he said. They moved through the woods in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet the only sound in the suffocating stillness. The path back to the house felt longer than it should have, as though the forest itself had shifted. When they finally emerged from the trees, the sight of the farmhouse should have been a relief. But it wasn't. The house looked different, its familiar shape somehow distorted, as if it were a reflection in a warped mirror. Tori hesitated at the edge of the clearing, her eyes wide with unease. "Kyle, do you see that?" Kyle nodded slowly, his chest tightening. The house felt wrong, its presence looming over them like a predator waiting to strike. But there was no other option. They had nowhere else to go. They approached cautiously, the weight of the entity's presence still pressing down on them. As they stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaked beneath their feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the eerie silence. Kyle opened the door slowly, his hand trembling. The interior of the house was dark, the air thick with a strange, metallic smell that made his stomach churn. "Tori," he whispered, glancing back at her. "Stay close." They moved through the house together, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive quiet. The furniture was still in its place, and nothing seemed overtly disturbed, but there was an underlying sense of wrongness that they couldn't ignore. Tori paused in the living room, her eyes drawn to the family photos on the mantel. The faces in the pictures seemed distorted, their features warped and blurred as though the images had been altered by an unseen hand. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Kyle didn't have an answer. He turned away from the photos, his focus shifting to the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls. It was the same sound they had heard in the woods, a low, vibrating frequency that set his teeth on edge. Then they heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from upstairs. Kyle froze, his heart racing. He glanced at Tori, who was staring at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes. "Stay here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Tori said immediately, grabbing his arm. "I'm coming with you." Kyle wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. He nodded reluctantly, and together they climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the windows. The hum grew louder as they approached Brandon's room, the door slightly ajar. Kyle pushed the door open slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The room was empty, but the bed was unmade, the sheets tangled and stained with something dark. On the wall above the bed, symbols had been scratched into the plaster. They weren't letters or numbers, nothing that made sense to the human mind. The shapes twisted and shifted as they looked at them, as though they were alive. Tori clutched Kyle's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice filled with dread. Before Kyle could respond, the symbols on the wall began to glow. A low, guttural sound filled the air, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Then they heard it, a voice faint and distorted but unmistakable. "Mom, Dad." It was Brandon. Tori gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Brandon," she cried, her voice breaking. The glowing symbols pulsed, and the voice grew louder. "I'm here," it said, the words layered with an otherworldly echo. "I can see everything now." "Where are you?" Kyle demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and desperation. "We're here, Brandon. We're here." The symbols on the wall flared brightly, and for a brief moment they saw him. A shadowy figure standing in a swirling void, his glowing red eyes staring back at them. "I'm not coming back," Brandon said, his voice calm and distant. "I belong to them now. And soon you will too." The room erupted in blinding light, and Kyle and Tori were thrown backward. When the light faded, the room was empty again, the symbols gone. They lay on the floor, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling. The hum had stopped, and the house was silent once more. But they both knew the truth. This wasn't over. Brandon was gone, but the entities weren't finished with them. Chapter 8: The Inheritance of Darkness. The farmhouse was no longer a sanctuary. It stood as a hollow husk of what it once was, imbued with the lingering presence of the incomprehensible forces that had claimed their son. Kyle and Tori huddled together in the dimly lit kitchen, their breaths shallow, the silence pressing in around them like a living thing. Tori held a cup of untouched coffee in her trembling hands, its warmth long since faded. Kyle paced back and forth, his movements erratic, his mind racing with thoughts that offered no solutions. Every corner of the house seemed alive with a faint vibration, a reminder that they were never truly alone. "We can't stay here," Tori said finally, her voice strained and brittle. She set the cup down with a trembling hand and looked at Kyle with tear-streaked eyes. "They're going to come back. You know they will." Kyle stopped pacing, his fists clenched at his sides. "And where are we supposed to go?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "They're not just here, Tori. They're everywhere. You saw what I saw." Tori flinched, her shoulders slumping as she buried her face in her hands. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice muffled. "I don't know what to do anymore." Kyle sighed, the anger draining from his face as he knelt beside her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch hesitant but comforting. "I'm sorry," he said softly. He broke off, shaking his head. "I'm scared too." They sat in silence for a moment, the faint hum in the walls the only sound. The events of the last few days had shattered their sense of reality, leaving them grasping for answers in a world that no longer made sense. Tori finally looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "We need help," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in it. Anyone, who can tell us what's happening." Kyle hesitated, his mind racing. Who could they turn to? The sheriff? The government? No one would believe them. And even if they did, what could they possibly do against forces like these? "There's no one," he said finally, his voice hollow. "No one who can stop this." Tori opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a loud metallic screech filled the air, making them both jump. The sound came from outside, a deep, grinding noise that set their teeth on edge. Kyle shot to his feet, his heart racing. "Stay here," he said, grabbing the shotgun they had kept by the door for emergencies. Tori grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not letting you go out there alone." He hesitated, his gaze flickering between her and the door. Finally, he nodded. "Fine," he said. "But stay behind me." They stepped outside into the cool night air, the shotgun heavy in Kyle's hands. The source of the noise was immediately apparent. The barn door, which had been firmly closed just hours ago, was now wide open, the hinges twisted and mangled. Kyle's grip tightened on the shotgun as he and Tori approached the barn cautiously. The air around it felt heavier, thicker, as though the very atmosphere was straining under an invisible weight. Inside, the darkness was almost impenetrable, the faint moonlight barely enough to illuminate the scattered tools and hay. The metallic smell they had noticed earlier was stronger here, mingling with the sharp tang of ozone. "Do you see anything?" Tori whispered, her voice barely audible. Kyle shook his head, his eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close," he murmured. They moved deeper into the barn, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The faint hum that had pervaded the house was louder here, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse in time with their racing hearts. Then they saw it. At the center of the barn, where the old tractor had once stood, was a strange, pulsating structure. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a mass of twisted, organic material that seemed to shimmer and shift in the dim light. Veins of glowing red light pulsed through it, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Tori gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is that?" Kyle didn't answer. He took a cautious step closer, his grip on the shotgun tightening. The structure seemed to react to his presence, the pulsing light intensifying as a low, guttural sound filled the air. "Don't," Tori said urgently, grabbing his arm. "Kyle, don't go near it." But it was too late. The structure shuddered, and a tendril of black, viscous material shot out, wrapping around Kyle's wrist. He cried out in pain, the shotgun falling from his grasp as the tendril pulled him toward the mass. Tori screamed and grabbed his other arm, pulling with all her strength. "Let him go," she shouted, her voice filled with desperation. The tendril tightened, and Kyle's vision swam as an overwhelming sense of dread filled his mind. Images flashed before his eyes, visions of destruction, chaos, and the vast, incomprehensible forms of the entities. And then he heard the voice. "You cannot fight us." The words echoed in his mind, each syllable resonating with a power that left him trembling. "You are part of us. This world is ours." Kyle gritted his teeth, his body shaking as he fought against the tendril's pull. "No," he growled through clenched teeth. "You can't have him. You can't have us." The tendril shuddered, and for a moment, the images in his mind faltered. Tori, seeing the brief hesitation, grabbed a nearby pitchfork and drove it into the base of the structure. The reaction was immediate. The tendril released Kyle, and the structure let out a high-pitched screech that made them both clap their hands over their ears. "Run!" Kyle shouted, grabbing Tori's hand and pulling her toward the barn door. They stumbled outside, the screeching sound still ringing in their ears. Behind them, the barn shuddered, the walls groaning as the structure inside seemed to convulse. The night sky above them began to change, the stars shifting and flickering as though something massive was moving through the heavens. The hum that had pervaded their lives grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Kyle and Tori fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the sound overwhelmed them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. They looked up, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The barn was still standing, but the light inside had faded. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Kyle reached out to Tori, his hand shaking. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. What just happened? Kyle didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the fight was far from over. The entities had made their intentions clear. This was only the beginning. Chapter 9. Into the Void. The days that followed felt like an eternity. The barn was silent now, the unnatural structure gone, leaving behind only a faint scorch mark on the dirt floor. But Kyle and Tori knew better than to think it was over. The entities weren't retreating, they were regrouping. Each night brought new horrors. Shadows that moved on their own, whispers that seemed to come from inside their skulls, and dreams that felt like glimpses into a reality far darker than their own. Kyle sat at the kitchen table, the shotgun resting beside him. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt from lack of sleep. Across from him, Tori scribbled notes in a journal, her handwriting frantic and uneven. They had started recording everything they could, anything to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around them. "We can't keep doing this," Tori said finally, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was hollow, the weight of their ordeal etched into every syllable. "We're just sitting here, waiting for them to take us." Kyle didn't respond immediately. He stared at the shotgun, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't put into words. "What else can we do?" he said eventually, his voice rough. "We don't even know what they want." Tori set down her pen and looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of desperation and determination. "Yes, we do," she said. "They want Brandon. And if we don't stop them, they'll destroy everything to get him." Kyle's jaw tightened, and he looked away. The mention of Brandon's name was like a knife to his chest. He had tried to hold on to hope, to believe that there was still a part of their son left to save. But each passing day made it harder to ignore the truth. "We have to go back," Tori continued, her voice trembling but resolute. "To the source. To where it all started." Kyle's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. "You're talking about the ship," he said. Tori nodded. "If there are answers, they're there. We have to face it, Kyle. We have to end this." Kyle stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You saw what happened last time," he said, his voice rising. "That thing isn't just some alien machine, it's connected to them. Going back there is suicide." Tori stood too, her hands balled into fists. "And staying here isn't," she shot back. "Look around, Kyle. This isn't living. This is waiting to die." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. Finally, Kyle nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine," he said quietly. "We'll go. But if this goes south, we get out. No heroics." Tori didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew there was no turning back. The journey to the crash site was harrowing. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The faint hum that had haunted their home followed them, growing louder as they approached the clearing. When they finally reached the site, Kyle felt his stomach drop. The ship was still there, its sleek, metallic surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. But it was different now. Pulsing red veins of light snaked across its hull, and the air around it shimmered with an unnatural heat. Tori took a shaky step forward, her eyes fixed on the ship. "It's changing," she whispered. "It's alive." Kyle tightened his grip on the shotgun and stepped in front of her. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. They approached cautiously, the ground beneath their feet feeling strangely soft, as though the earth itself was rejecting the ship's presence. As they drew closer, the hum grew louder, vibrating through their bones and setting their teeth on edge. At the base of the ship, the hatch was open, its edges glowing faintly. Kyle exchanged a glance with Tori, his expression grim. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Tori nodded, her face pale but determined. "We have to know," she said. Kyle took a deep breath and stepped inside, the shotgun raised. Tori followed close behind, her hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. The interior of the ship was dark, the walls covered in the same pulsing veins of light they had seen outside. The air was thick, making it hard to breathe. The hum was deafening now, drowning out everything else. As they moved deeper into the ship, the walls seemed to close in around them, the space growing narrower and more claustrophobic. Tori reached out to touch Kyle's arm, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing ahead. Kyle squinted, his heart pounding. At the end of the corridor was a faint glow, a pulsing red light that seemed to beckon them forward. They approached cautiously, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they reached the source of the light, Kyle felt his breath catch in his throat. It was Brandon. He stood in the center of the room, his body bathed in the eerie red glow. His eyes, once so full of life, were now a piercing crimson, staring straight ahead with an intensity that made Kyle's chest ache. "Brandon," Tori whispered, her voice breaking. She took a step forward, but Kyle grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he said, his voice low and tense. "Something's wrong." As if in response, Brandon's head turned slowly toward them, his expression blank. "Mom." "Dad," he said, his voice layered with an unnatural echo. Tori's tears spilled over, and she tried to move closer, but Kyle held her back. "Brandon," he said, his voice trembling. "It's us. We're here to help you." Brandon tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Help me," he said, his tone almost mocking. "You can't help me. You can't stop them." Kyle's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Brandon, please," he said. "Fight them. You're stronger than this." Brandon's expression didn't change, but the room seemed to shudder, the pulsing light intensifying. "You don't understand," he said. "This is who I am, who I've always been. They showed me the truth." Tori broke free from Kyle's grip and stepped forward, her hands outstretched. "Brandon, listen to me," she said, her voice desperate. "We love you. Whatever they've told you, it's a lie. You're our son." For a moment, Brandon hesitated. The light in his eyes flickered, and his expression softened. But then the ship roared to life, the hum rising to a deafening crescendo. Brandon's body stiffened, and his eyes flared brighter than ever. "It's too late," he said, his voice booming with the entity's power. "They're coming, and this world will burn." The ship shuddered violently, and the walls began to close in, the veins of light spreading and pulsing faster. Kyle grabbed Tori's arm, pulling her back. "We have to go," he shouted over the noise. Tori resisted, her eyes locked on Brandon. "No," she screamed. "I'm not leaving him." "Tori," Kyle shouted, his voice filled with panic. The room erupted in blinding light, and for a brief moment, Kyle thought it was the end. Chapter 10: The Crimson Dawn. The light swallowed everything. For a moment, Kyle was sure he was dead. There was no sound, no feeling, just an overwhelming sense of weightlessness, as though the universe had unraveled around him. Then, slowly, the light began to fade and sensation returned. He was lying on the forest floor. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and metal, and the faint hum of the ship was gone. Kyle pushed himself up, his body aching, and looked around. The clearing was in ruins. The ship was no longer intact, its sleek, alien design reduced to jagged fragments scattered across the ground. The pulsating veins of light had disappeared, leaving only a faint, unnatural glow in the air. "Tori!" Kyle's voice cracked as he scrambled to his feet. "Tori, where are you?" A weak groan drew his attention. He turned to see Tori lying a few feet away, half covered in debris. He rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he pulled the wreckage away. "Tori, wake up," he said, his voice shaking. "Please wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, and she winced, her hand going to her head. "Kyle," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he said, his relief palpable. "You're okay. We're okay." She sat up slowly, her gaze darting around the clearing. "The ship," she said, her voice hollow. "What happened?" Kyle shook his head. "I don't know," he admitted. "There was a light, and then," he trailed off, his mind racing to piece together the events. And then he remembered. "Brandon," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Tori's eyes widened, and she scrambled to her feet, her movements frantic. "Where is he?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Kyle, where's our son?" They searched the clearing, their desperation growing with each passing moment. But Brandon was nowhere to be found. The only trace of him was a faint scorch mark on the ground where he had stood, its edges glowing faintly. "He's gone," Tori said, her voice breaking. She fell to her knees, her hands covering her face. "Oh God, he's gone." Kyle knelt beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He didn't know what to say. How could he offer comfort when he felt the same crushing weight of despair? But their grief was short-lived. A low rumble echoed through the forest, the ground trembling beneath them. Kyle stood, his eyes scanning the trees. "What now?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by a deep, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air grew colder, and the faint glow from the ship's remains began to intensify, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. And then they saw it. The trees parted, and a figure stepped into the clearing. It was Brandon, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and grotesque, his skin pale and translucent, revealing the glowing red veins beneath. His eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and his movements were jerky, as though he were a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. "Mom. Dad," he said, his voice layered with the echoes of countless other voices. "It's time." Tori staggered to her feet, her face pale. "Brandon," she said, her voice trembling. "What have they done to you?" Brandon tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "They've shown me the truth," he said. "This world is broken, and I am the key to fixing it." Kyle raised the shotgun, his hands shaking. "Fixing it," he demanded. "You call this fixing?" Brandon didn't respond. He raised a hand, and the air around him seemed to ripple. The fragments of the ship began to levitate, the glowing veins reappearing as they reassembled themselves into a new, grotesque form. The ship was alive again, but it was no longer a vessel. It was a weapon. Kyle and Tori backed away as the structure loomed over them, its surface pulsing with light. The hum returned, louder than ever, and the air grew thick with the scent of ozone. "Run," Kyle said, his voice barely audible over the noise. Tori didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Brandon, tears streaming down her face. "Brandon, please," she said. "You're stronger than this. Fight them." Brandon's expression flickered, and for a brief moment, Kyle thought he saw a glimmer of their son in his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a cold, unfeeling stare. "There is no Brandon," he said. "There is only the crimson dawn." The ship roared to life, its glowing veins spreading into the ground. The earth cracked and splintered, and the sky above them turned blood red. A deep, guttural voice echoed from the ship, speaking in a language that defied comprehension. Kyle grabbed Tori's arm, pulling her back. "We have to go," he shouted. "Now!" They ran, the ground shaking beneath them as the ship unleashed its power. Trees were uprooted, the air filled with the sound of splintering wood and roaring flames. The forest was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield. They reached the edge of the clearing, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Kyle turned to look back, his heart sinking at the sight. The ship was fully transformed now, its shape shifting and writhing like a living creature. Brandon stood at its center, his body glowing with the same red light. "He's gone," Kyle said, his voice hollow. Tori shook her head, her expression fierce. "No," she said. "We can't give up on him. Not yet." Kyle stared at her, his mind racing. She was right. They couldn't leave Brandon, not like this. But how could they fight something so far beyond their understanding? Tori grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the tree-line. "We need to find a way to stop it," she said. "Whatever it takes." Kyle nodded, his resolve hardening. They had faced the impossible before. They would do it again. The fight wasn't over. Thank you for tuning in to this spine-chilling journey through the unknown. If you felt the dread, the tension, and the thrill of every twist, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button to let us know you survived this nightmare. Share this tale with fellow seekers of the dark and mysterious, and bring them into the shadows with you. And remember, the next story may be just around the corner, waiting for you in the dark. Subscribe now and join us for more tales that will haunt your dreams. Until next time, keep your lights on. You never know what's lurking in the dark.